So I'm really pleased to be representing Journalists for Human Rights on this call, and I just want to thank our amazing partners, the Indigenous Journalists Association and APTN News, for being part of this program. It is working together that's really, making this program a real success and hopefully paving us for the future. So just a bit of housekeeping. So there's going to be about 30 minutes of presentation and then about 10 minutes of Q&A. This meeting is being recorded and will be posted to YouTube, including the Q&A, so just keep that in mind. You can either feel free to drop your questions in the chat as we go, and then I can read them out at the end in the Q&A portion, or when it comes time, just raise your hand. I don't think we'll be a big enough group that will be a problem. So if there's any questions about that, please feel free to drop them in the chat. But otherwise, I would like to introduce Tristan Ahtone, who is a member of the Kiowa tribe and is editor-at-large at Grist. He previously served as editor-in-chief at the Texas Observer and Indigenous Affairs editor at High Country News. He has reported for Al Jazeera America, PBS NewsHour, Indian Country Today, and NPR, just to name a few. And he is a past president of the Native American Journalists Association, which is now IGA, who's our partner in this program. And Ahtone was a 2017 Neiman Fellow. So with that, please take it away.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Hi, everybody. My name is Tristan. As Sarah said, I'm editor-at-large at Grist. And I manage our Indigenous Affairs desk. I've been a feature writer since about 2013 when I began working for Al Jazeera America after escaping public radio. And I've been a full-time editor specializing in narrative and investigative features since about 2018. When I teach story structure and feature writing, it typically takes a couple of days, if not an entire semester. So my challenge today will be to get some of the basics to you in 30 minutes. And with that, I think we can probably jump right in. I'm aware that some of you have been through journalism school, others have not. Many of you are likely familiar, at least, with the idea of leads, nut graphs, context analysis, all the different elements that are woven into a journalism piece. Some of you may have been unfortunate enough to learn about the inverted pyramid structure. No shade to your teachers on that if you did, but I want you to do everything in your power to sort of forget that structure or any of its derivatives, like the martini glass structure, any of the different creative names that people have come up with to try and improve on that structure. So what I'm going to talk about is our structures that are really designed to pull readers through your story and kind of give them emotional reactions to your work. So what we talk about more today is just how we can use our work to really engage audiences' emotions and feelings. And I should preface that this could be considered a form of the dark arts. So I'm hoping that you will use these skills essentially for good in your writing. Let's see. Can everybody see the slides here? Looks good. Cool. Okay. So again, I've worked in radio, television, online, and magazine journalism for almost 20 years, and I think before we even talk about story structure, we have to talk about the most fundamental sort of like building block of good structure, which is like the actual story. No matter how good you are at structuring stories, no matter how good of a writer you are, like if you don't have a story, like your skills just won't matter, right? Like essentially you can't structure a story if you don't have a story to tell. So we're going to just start with like building blocks of story. No matter what I'm working on, be it a story I'm reporting or a writer I'm editing, I'm always asking for these, that some very specific elements are identified. That's a specific protagonist. I'm looking for that protagonist to have some sort of objective or a barrier that they're trying to like overcome. I'm trying to establish like the stakes of that struggle, like what are the consequences essentially if they fail to reach their objective or overcome that barrier. And I'm also always looking for sort of like the catalyst to like that quest or that journey that they're on, really like an inciting incident that has really put them on this path. These are like absolutely essential to sort of like any story that you work on. And this is also why it can be incredibly difficult to write about, like, say, an artist, because the stakes of like to paint or not to paint can be very hard to communicate to an audience. It doesn't mean that it can't be done. It just makes it very, very difficult sometimes. But this is also why like writing about sports is often like the clearest path to these elements. Like generally the athlete is just trying to win, right? So like you can really do a lot with that kind of trajectory. And I think clear stakes are really what level up any story that you work on, right? Like the clearer the stakes and the more surprising the stakes, like the better your story is going to be. So I shared the Klamath story with you, and don't worry, I didn't expect y'all to read like the whole thing. Kudos to those of you who did. But if you read the first chapter, like the stakes of that story are pretty clear. Like if the tribes didn't remove the dams, there'd be the potential to lose salmon altogether and see the, traditions, cultures, and practices of the tribes involved disappear. Like the stakes kind of are the future, but what makes the story work well is that the writers have really been able to like be very clear and very precise, specific about details, like the details of that future and of those stakes, right? And it's the same with the Res Dog story that I shared. It's much more newsy, but it's still a news feature, and I think the stakes in that are pretty clear that like animals will have to endure pain in the face of climate change. And I should say, shout out to the writer who I saw was on this call, Taylor. Thank you for sharing your story. We're gonna be going through it. Maybe Taylor can answer some questions too if folks have. So so let's kind of take a look, like all of these elements here, protagonist, objective, stakes, inciting incident. What we talk a lot about is sort of like putting them into a sentence. We call it a log line. And, basically it's like, you can kind of make it look like this. There are all kinds of ways to slice this thing, but, generally it's like when this thing happened, like a specific person had to like do a thing. Um, or else this would happen, right? Like these are the elements that you really want to be looking for in your stories, and you really shouldn't proceed any further on stories until you can really like identify these elements. They will make your story easier to write, and I can almost, not 100%, but almost guarantee that your editors will be more open to accepting your pitches, like if they can also see the trajectory of the story that you're going to tell, right? Like you're going to see all of those elements, and you sort of know what you're getting. So if we were to like reverse engineer, for instance, like Klamath here, like when the corporation behind a series of dams on the Klamath River were required to renew their licenses with the federal government, tribal nations stepped in to wage a 20-year campaign to demolish the structures, free the river, save endangered species, and reclaim their heritage. Like there's all kinds of ways that you can write that line, but you really get a sense of sort of like what is going on here, like with the story that's going to be told. And again, these are like the building blocks for like story, like all the nuance and the politics and the history, the like thematic areas that you want to explore, like they will come later and they will come in your story. But the story DNA is sort of like the tree that you need to hang your ornaments on, or the cake that you're going to decorate, or whatever metaphor you prefer. But the big thing is that these elements are sort of like what sells your story and gets you in the door and lets you sort of report. Um, so this is the first thing, is that you really need all of this stuff to be able to like pull together like solid structures and solid stories. And again, these are things that you can always be practicing when you're like talking to friends, when you're talking to relatives. You can ask them, was like, well, what were you trying to do? Like, well, what happened if you didn't do that? Like, I do this all the time with people because I'm really interested in the stories that like day-to-day stories about like I was just trying to get the internet hooked up, and like I was on hold for forever and yada, like all of this kind of stuff is like really, like you get these little stories in people's lives and you start identifying those elements, makes a huge difference. Um, so I'm visual learner here. I essentially drew these things out. I mentioned at the beginning to sort of forget like the inverted pyramid and urge you not. I also urge you not to like read too deeply into the shapes on the screen. They don't really mean anything. It just looks better than like black blobs or boxes or anything like that. So, um, I also want to be clear on everything I talk about today. Like this is stuff is like not set in stone. It's not gospel. Like these are really simply just tools to help you write more efficiently and be more organized in your reporting. So this form that I'm showing you here is sort of to some degree an industry standard. It works. You really can't go wrong with it. Like, can you improve on it? Yeah, for sure. Can you escape from it? Like, probably only after you've mastered it. But like if you take note, sort of like learn it, you can really identify it when you see it, and then you've got something to fall back on when you're writing, and then maybe in the future you don't have to rely on it at all because you've figured out a different way to tell stories. So this is just a kind of standardish tool to sort of like play with. Um, a good feature, so these are all the elements. We're going to go into each one of them. Lead, nut graph, all the different blocks of analysis, resolution. So we'll just go through each one of these here. So um, a good feature needs a killer lead. So, today your reader has like 1,000 entertainment options in the palm of their hand. You have to compete with Instagram, TikTok trends, pimple popping videos, like hundreds of other news outlets. Like you need to get people to stay on your story, which means you have to write like the life of your story depends on it, which it technically does. So again, take the Res Dog story. Writer Taylor opens with action, and it's not just a retelling of what happened. It's told through the eyes of her main character, Julie Casador. So you are on San Carlos with her. You're seeing the smoke, and you're hearing the propane tanks exploding. But then she does something sort of like really interesting is she like ups the tension by telling you that calls are coming in about animals and really drops us into Casador's night. It's quite harrowing, and it's a really good lead. Like we're given enough information to know what's happening, and we're given enough action that we want to stick with the story and know more, know what's going to happen to the character, or at least I hope we do. I am intrigued and I want to know more. Um, so you've kind of got your standard lead. You're going to hit your nut graph right after this. I don't know if it's called that in Canada. I know some reporters call it the billboard. Either way, it's the sort of like paragraph, the statement in which the writer tells the reader what the story is. Like it justifies the story by telling readers why they should care. It tells the reader that when you're done reading, this is what you'll know, and often tells them why the story is timely. A lot of times nowadays, I actually really like to think of this sort of graph as like almost a form of like free prior and informed consent. Like this is what I'm offering, and I hope that you're going to read on. I'm not going to be throwing any other like surprises at you. I mean, there may be surprises in how you write and twist and turn, but it's not going to be a different story than what you're sort of getting in this like billboard or nut graph or anything. The story, the nut graph in the story just begins. The watchfire began with arson, but high temperatures and other drier conditions driven by climate change exacerbated the blaze. Like you know what you're going to get in this story, and it's absolutely critical to any story you write, and is like almost the most difficult thing to write. Like nut graphs are like super hard. Like they take almost half of my writing time. The lead takes another 25-30%. And the other thing is that you absolutely have to write the like nut graph first. Like if you save it to the end, uh, you will experience nothing but pain and regret. I promise. Like, don't learn the hard way like I did and then have to rewrite the entire story because the nut graph promised something different than what you wrote, right? Like, this is designed to for the audience and also just as much for you to sort of like direct you as to sort of like where you are going. Once you've kind of spent your like last 3 hours pulling your hair out over the nut graph and lead, and you've only got another hour or so to file. Like, don't worry. This is like, I think, in my opinion, sort of the easiest part, which is like your sort of story support, which we're labeling like blocks here, basically. Um, each one of these like supporting blocks, like paragraphs, are blocks on different subjects that are all sort of related to each other and to the nut graph. And I don't really have a better describer for this section than like just blocks. It makes them sound boring. They're not boring. This is just like this is when you really get to work in all that nuance and art and all the different big ideas that you want to get into a story. So if you treat with them sort of with respect and love, they'll do the same for your story. In the case of the Res Dog story, each one of the graphs builds really on the main idea. Like you learn the context of the issue and that COVID played a big role in it. You learn that we don't even know how big the problem is. You learn that there's so much overcrowding that euthanasia rates are going up, especially in Indigenous communities. I should also note that the writer's done something interesting, like in this section, like she's added little anecdotes. So, for instance, we get to meet Norman Begay on the Navajo Nation, and his story adds even more context. Same with the programs on Wind River and on other reservations. If you were in a pinch for space, you could cut these sections and the story would be fine. It wouldn't be as wonderful, but it would still work. Um, but as I said, if you get creative with this section, you can really breathe a lot of life into your story. And I think the trick with the anecdotes is again that they all need to sort of speak to the main idea in the lead and nut graph. They're the supporting pillars of your piece. Um, and one other thing to sort of note about these sort of like different supporting like pillars and blocks is that like if you write these things well, you can move them around sort of any way you like. Like, and this will be important for this next section. So like bear with me on this kind of like technical side here. Like if you sort of like think about dividing your paragraphs in ways that group ideas, like how something happened, why it happened, the implications of the happening, like this makes things really easy to edit. And is like really easy for readers to digest. They would just move naturally from idea to idea to idea. You don't have to have like impact spread across like 6 different paragraphs. You don't need to group it by like by sources, which is a common thing that a lot of reporters do, is grouping all of these graphs by sources. You really want to move these things like ideas. And as you can see here, like maybe you start with statistics, you move to impact, you go to context. Maybe instead you want to start with impact, move to context, and then go to statistics, right? Like these can be moved any way that you need. Um, and to create different effects like for your audience and your readers. And we'll get more into that here in a little bit. Um, but yeah, think about grouping them, dividing them, that kind of thing. The same notion can also just be used to like move through time too. So if you have a more narrative story, like you can move from past to present to future, like maybe you want to start with the future and move backwards in time. Maybe, there's all these different ways that like, stories have beginning, middle, and end, and it's not necessarily told in that order, right? Also, this is great, especially if you're working on something that's a little newsier. Is there a sudden development in the story? You can just add a block to it, what it means, that kind of a thing. You're able to really like roll with the ideas, roll with the narrative, that kind of a thing. And you see the sort of like these like main ideas of the Dog story here. Like again, um, like I said, roots of problem, lack of statistics, impact of overcrowding. Like it's the same story if you just move these things around, right? There are no statistics. Overcrowding has serious impacts, and the reason for those two things has a lot to do with COVID. Like I've told you the exact same thing, just in a different order. But the writer has chosen to do it in this way for particular reasons, again, which we'll get to. But again, like um, when you're writing in a way that makes information like modular, you can really use that information to create emotional moments. And again, I think that like for me, journalism is really the creative use of reality, and like these sort of like tricks will allow you to get creative in your storytelling. Um, so finally, in that structure, we get to resolution. Basically, it's just return to the main character. It's the end of your story. Like here we get back to in Res Dogs, we get back to Julie Casador. And it's a really nice bit. She won a major award for her work. She's overcoming the problem that she's been struggling with. In the real world, people don't always overcome their struggle. Many times they're defeated by it. That's okay to write in your story, but the point is that we're seeing some sort of change in the main character that we started, and we sort of like bookend the story between like, the main person at the beginning and the end. It signals to the audience that the story is essentially like over. Um, and again, it's sort of the DNA of the story that we talked about at the beginning, like a character with a problem, they're struggling with it, and then they find that solution, right? So again, flying through this, but easy peasy. You got a little container, hold all the information you have, and the more you work with it, the more you'll understand the form, recognize it. Again, though, this is sort of like the surface level of feature writing. This is kind of the visible structure that you can see like very clearly on a page, or you look at a newspaper or mag or whatever, or even online, like you can kind of see the structure very, very quickly. So what I'd like to talk about next here are some of the more like emotional undercurrents that are happening. Again, the sort of like dark arts that I hinted at earlier, because there's something else that's going on in this Res Dog story besides just providing information. There are a number of like emotional beats that the writer is hitting that are really designed to push on your emotions and push you further into the story. So inside this container, there's essentially like a 4-act structure built into the story. So I'm going to go over the 4-act structure oh so briefly here. I'm sure folks are familiar with the 3-act structure. It's essentially the same 4 acts. But it's derived from sort of like dramatic structure in theater, film, and television, right? Like it essentially like divides your story into 4 major parts to really help with the pacing. You Essentially what we're doing here is like dividing it into like first act is like setup, second act is context, third act is confrontation, fourth act is like resolution. Um, this sort of 4-act structure really helps you map your story, especially feature stories, and like think about the things that you will need to make it work. Um, and I should also say that this is like a readily available off-the-shelf structure, essentially, and like dramatic writing. Like it's designed to help you get off the ground as a storyteller and a feature writer. But like I, just to be clear, it's like it's only a tool, right? Like learn it, understand it, master it, and then throw it away or improve on it, whatever you want to do. But if you understand what these different moments are doing, you can move on to much more creative structures and ideas in the future, right? Like basically, like good writing is like jazz. When you understand the structure of the music, you can start improvising and take it anywhere you like. Um, like I said, you can also stick with the structure and improve on it. 4/4 time in music has been used by everyone from like Mozart to Johnny Cash, right? Like nearly every artist you listen to relies on 4/4 time in music. It's fine, it works, and you can do mind-blowing things with that time signature, right? It's the same with storytelling structure. And again, this comes from feature films, and at least 90% of the films you see in theaters these days really rely on a very similar structure, right? They're designed to keep you in the movie, and it's designed to have you engage with the movie. Um, So let's see. I mean, I'm particularly interested in sort of playing with story structures, like in understanding this, but also like moving on from them. So we can talk a little bit about more of that down the line. But like again, yeah, we're gonna play with this one. So um, again, I know I'm going through this very, very fast. This usually takes a couple of days. So please like write down your notes, questions, that kind of thing. I'll try to get to them. So if I'm breaking down like res dogs here a little bit, just looking at Act One, right? Like you've got all the sort of like same phrases here that are in the sort of like the container and everything. But so we have the lead and the nut graph, which we talked about, and then right after that we go into some pretty tight sections to provide a lot of exposition to readers, right? Like essentially the setup that allows you to really expand on like the nut graph or your character's involvement with the nut graph. In any story they're working on, like If you need to start adding information like where the story is taking place, if it requires a lot of explanation, or maybe even like explanation on like time or anything else, like this sort of like being able to think of a section of like setup really allows you to start filling in story exposition. And one reason it works here is because you've hopefully already hooked your reader with a good lead and sort of justified the read with like a strong nut graph. So then you can really start building on the like universe that you've already created very, very quickly. Um, so again, like, remembering the DNA that we talked about earlier, like, the catalyst, the inciting incident. This is essentially where you can drop it in and give it space to breathe. Like, you know, um, what is that thing? Is it the federal government's new regulations? Is it melting permafrost? Is it a return of the bubonic plague? Like, whatever it is, like, there's a reason you're telling this story, and this, like, it gives you a place to sort of like park that information and push the story forward, including sort of like dramatic tension and whatnot in through these sections here. Um, this is, I guess, one of the things here is that you can sort of like think of it like Spider-Man a little bit, first act of Spider-Man, right? Like Peter Parker getting bit by a spider isn't like the catalyst that turns him into Spider-Man. It's like the death of a loved one, right? Like technically the like spider bites like the setup, right? Like I don't know. I don't know who dies in the new remakes or whatever, but still, like I just remember, it's like Uncle Ben. Uncle Ben dies, and like he becomes Spider-Man, right? Um, so basically, like Act One, you're laying out like a coherent story. The reader knows what they're going to get. They're familiar with all the elements that are going to drive the story, and hopefully, they're generally feeling like grounded in what you're going to tell them. And you'll see here like questions, tension, stuff like that. That means it's for a good feature. It can be the place where you start to complicate those feelings a little bit. Like maybe it's a hard question that doesn't actually have an answer. Maybe it's you spelling out that there's no good solution to what's happening. Maybe you're dropping in an entirely new element that twists all of that opening exposition in new ways that makes a reader like think twice about it, right? Like the bottom line is that you're really sort of teasing the audience to keep them reading and like thinking and engaging with your story. So, you can sneak in thematic elements that you want somebody to engage with. Like if we look at res dogs here, we get the lead, we get the nut graph, and then we get the setup and catalyst essentially in the same graph. Like COVID really set this problem up. And now the problem is puppy season that lasts year round. And then finally, what she's sort of doing in that like tension area is like she's turning that up by saying summers are getting hotter and now even more animals are suffering from dehydration. Like this is essentially what's happening in this like first section, this act one of this story. Um, Technically, as a reader, you probably don't even have to read more if you don't want to. She's been able to contain all of the major points you need. You get a little story, you know what the problem is, but of course, the way that it's written, you're really being asked to sort of like keep reading. And before you know it, technically you're into like Act Two. Um, if I look at Act Two in this story and in most features is again where you're kind of having the context stuff. This section is really designed to give your reader a break and allow you to shift gears also. Like generally this is where like you get to sort of like end your first act and your character story, and you get to just like shift scenes and you can like go deeper into the context. You can go deeper into the history. Like you can go into like the crunchy, like nerdy stuff basically, right? Like it's a good place to like put a lot of that contextual information. You can explain that complex environmental policy, right? Nobody wants to read the complex environmental policy in like your first act or your first four paragraphs, right? Like it can be a little bit mind numbing sometimes, but there is a good place to put it after you've told a little like story and given a little treat, right? Like you can highlight the history of that, like the treaty that got us here. You can tell us about the scent receptors in a dog's nose and how they work, right? Like whatever that you want to sort of like do when it comes to like nerdy policy, science, history, stuff like that. The things that really give your story even more detail and like information, they can really go in this section, like that context and history. Um, and what I think also works really well is that after you've told us about that context and history, and given us all that detail, you can kind of move into more or less the scope, right? Like you can zoom out and show how much impact that history, that context, and the story we've read so far, like you can see what the wider impact is on communities. Again, I talked about stakes earlier. This is where you can really drive those stakes home. That if this policy isn't passed, it won't just have an impact on this fish in this particular river. It will allow industries nationwide to hurt any fish in any river, stuff like that. Like you're able to sort of like give like a big picture zoom out basically of what's going on. And again, looking to Res Dogs, here the writers like reset the narrative in Act Two, like on Navajo Nation, to let us see that the problem is pretty big and pretty spread out, and that there are deadly consequences, including the dog mauling attack. And then just dropped in a graph about the scope that we don't even know how bad the problem is, right? Like we don't even have statistics. So this is like a really tight little like act two that's, you're getting even more like information on what's going on. Um, okay, act three, rushing through. So in the third act, you really want to be getting back into action and story if possible. Typically, you want to be coming back to the character you open the piece with, but it's not always necessary. The big thing here is that you've had a fairly jam-packed opening. You got a little break to sort of understand context and big picture. And now you really need to get back on the ground with real people. So a lot of times giving us some action, giving us some conflict that really, really sort of like resets and gets us back into the main story that we came here for. Here in Res Dogs, Taylor like pulls in a nonprofit that helps place us on the ground in the story and understand that shelters are more crowded and it's hard to get dogs off reservation for adoption. But you also notice here, like on the chart about sort of hitting like this low point. This is also comes from dramatic theater as well too. Like the third act is really designed to get us like back to the on the ground activities, but also to pull kind of at our heartstrings a little bit. Like you should really take readers to a place of like sadness or anger, quite honestly, I think. In some cases, it could be joy if you really like get this form down, but like you need to be engaging with their feelings. And I think the writer's done a really good job of doing that in this story by making it clear that there are like too many dogs are not getting adopted, and as a result, they're being like euthanized, right? Like I don't like hearing that. Like, we've been filtered down through all of these facts and information and all this context. We know what's going on. We know that it's nationwide, and like like it almost makes me want to stop reading because like it's like one of my greatest wishes that all animals have like safe, happy homes, right? Like I don't like reading this, you know. So the third act is really like an emotional sort of like gut punch in a way. And the thing about like taking readers someplace dark like that is that you have to pull them back out. So like that's where this kind of idea of like regrouping comes in, and I think Taylor's done a really nice job at that by giving us an almost exhaustive list of places and organizations that are working hard to prevent that, right? Like when it becomes almost too much, she shows us that there's something like to be hopeful about. It sort of like pulls us out of that like low point in the third act. Um, Finally, fourth act, these are often really, really short, the ending of your story, but again, this is where we return to our main character. In this case, it's Julie Cassador, and we have an opportunity to reiterate the big points if you want. In longer features, you can revisit the nut graph and the big questions you raised in like the first act, like do you have answers now? Are there still none? Are the answers even more complicated than you thought originally? Like, are we even asking the right questions? Like this allows you to even like editorialize a little bit if you're writing for a place that allows that, and like, you're doing a 5,000 word feature, for instance, or longer. Um, Again, you can also just go back to your main character, let them comment, maybe add their own spin. In this case, Julie is adding a new dimension by like bringing up racism, but we're also learning about her story and her journey. And in fact, we like now get to see that she's getting supported by her tribe too. Essentially, she's getting resolution, right? And what I do love about the story is that I don't think it's like a necessarily easy resolution. In fact, I'm still left with like a bit of a feeling of unease when I read this. Like there's no easy solution to this issue, and I feel like I'm left sort of like thinking about like what role I could play in this somehow, which I think is really effective, like effective writing, if you sort of question your place in a story. But I think that's again one of the things that can make this form and sort of like narrative journalism so powerful is that if you're thinking about how you're working with a reader and what they're thinking and feeling, that's something that's really important. So um, again, we use this structure on nearly every feature story that comes across our IA desk. There are some exceptions. I'm working on a story right now in which like this entire structure is essentially completely scrambled after the second act, because I think it provides like some really complex emotional possibilities for the reader. I have another feature right now that we utilize this structure up until like act 3, and then essentially transition to a courtroom drama and repeat the structure inside the third act. It's really complicated. But basically, as long as you understand what the text is doing to the reader and what the information can do, like you can really take this wherever you want. Like, again, I'm like really interested in the structures of like Indigenous stories. Like they move differently, their rhythms are completely different. The way in which they deliver information and narrative is different. Like, I want to know how they might be better understood, like in the capacity of writing and storytelling to really provide better pathways for delivering news and feature stories to Indigenous audiences, for instance, right? But this is all to say that if you know how story works, you can really kind of like get away with anything. Um, how am I on time?
We should move into the Q&A part.
Let's
But
move into
if you've got
Q&A.
me kind of wrapping up, like if there's
Okay.
another slide or two, then that's okay.
I'll just real briefly on Klamath. Klamath, 14,000 word story. Um, Uses a 4 act structure in each one of those chapters. I can just tell you, like, yeah, we ripped off more or less the 4 act structure that's used here that doesn't follow those emotional beats. It follows character impacts and decisions, and we more or less ripped it off from Breaking Bad. We'll call it inspiration, whatever. If you if you're a fan of the show or you watch it, like every single episode is structured the exact same. It's actually kind of amazing that they were able to pull off like 5 seasons of the exact same structure in every single show. And we were watching it and learning from it and thinking, this is something that we can use to make a 14,000 word story a lot more like um, a lot more engaging to readers. So like inspiration comes from all kinds of places, all sorts of structures exist to like help with your writing. So, well, I can take some questions.
Love that. Thank you. And yeah, totally like good storytelling is good storytelling. And I find that it's a really interesting way that you talked about looking at structure. Because I think often, I know in my experience in journalism, we let the story tell us what the structure is, and maybe coming at it from a different angle will allow us to tell different and better stories. So that's very cool. All right. Does anybody have any questions? There haven't been any in the chat, but if anybody wants to like raise their hand. Maybe I can ask one and then we'll
Go
wrap
ahead.
up if nobody like just settle your thoughts, folks. My question is so for reporters who are kind of just starting out, what are some of the good habits that they can get into early in terms of like gathering stories, like in the interview process, that kind of thing? What kind of good habits can they get into that will then support their having enough puzzle pieces to make a good story structure?
Yeah, like I said, I mean, I think it's really learning those like story elements. Like, again, I tend to do this like a lot because when I like and one of the things I really like about journalism is that I'm like technically like kind of antisocial and don't really like to talk to a lot of people. But when I'm reporting, I get to be in complete control of the like conversation and be as social as I like because I just get to be nosy, right? So actually, playing with myself a lot in my personal life. Will be like at a party and be like, hey, what like, like tell me about your work. Oh, like tell me about like something you're working on. Like I try to figure out what that person's like story is a lot because I'm actually really interested, and also it just helps me in a social situation because I'm not always good at them. But like I being able to try this out again, like what are you trying to do and what happens if you don't do it? Like is a huge thing to really like just practice. Friends, family, random people. You can build some really amazing stories about like just regular everyday stories about people like doing, again, trying to get your internet turned on or your phone fixed or something like that, right? Like there's all of these like amazing ways to sort of like think about this and practice it. But I mean, the big thing is you really like the sooner you understand the elements of like what a story is, the faster you're going to be able to tell the stories that you want to. And I think, in my career, like it took me 10 years to figure out what the story elements were. And when I finally like learned it, I was like, oh, why the hell didn't anybody tell me this before? Because it's like, I'm to some degree a little perplexed as to why journalism schools or even a lot of creative writing programs don't spend a lot of time going over this because it's like, these are like fundamentals to how like human brains are wired for story, right? We hear this all the time. And technically, like a lot of the time, at least in my educational career, I don't know if it's the same with everybody's, but like I didn't get a lot of the sort of like, here's what that is, like here's what that thing is. So again, I would really encourage everybody to just be thinking about that. Like read a story and think about, for instance, like how would I how would I write this in one sentence? Like what would I need to do to make that work, kind of a thing. It's a great skill to sort of like get into and a great practice to be into. And yeah, it takes you a lot further um, um, than trying to learn the hard way.
Totally. Thank you. So we have a few questions in the chat. So the first is, would you be able to elaborate a bit more on how Indigenous approaches to storytelling could be better integrated into, and the questioner is not 100% sure if that's like the good formulation of the sentence, but could be integrated into standard journalism story structure. And what are some of the main challenges or points of tension in doing so?
Yeah, I mean, um, uh, the short answer is like yes, it's probably fairly easy to move it into standard journalism structures or newsrooms. The central tension point is whether or not you have a newsroom that's going to support you in doing that. So, I mean, I've been very lucky in my career to do a lot of experimental work with everything from like graphic novels to like just wild investigative pieces that we did a whole magazine at High Country News that was set 50 years in the future and everything and it was written like 50 years in the future. So like the magazine got sent back in time basically. Like if you've got a place that will support that kind of work, that's the biggest thing. But I mean, again, like anything is possible. It's just whether or not where you work is going to let you do that basically. As for like what those structures look like, I mean, it depends on your like nation and what kind of what kind of story that you're like sort of learning from. I mean, like there's all kinds of different kind of stories in different ways and different times of year, for instance, to be telling stories. So there's a lot of considerations that you have to make and think about. But generally, you know, um, Kiowa stories move very differently halfway through. They become like completely different stories, right? Like they're just like they're really interesting in how they work. So it just depends on if you have a newsroom that's brave enough to try something new, and you know what you're doing, because that's the big thing. It's like if this is an advanced move that is sort of like it's really hard to pull off early career, but if it's something you're working toward, like you got to bring your A game and backing it up, basically.
Definitely. Sort of the last part of that question was, how can journalists engage with editors proactively to better address this, like to better integrate different kinds of story structures?
I mean, I think all relationships with editors are like creative relationships, right? Like if you have an editor that you work with and that you can talk to. I mean, I really do my best to work with writers and talk through what like what they want and what I want. I don't know, Taylor's in the room, maybe she can say otherwise.
Taylor's just like,
But
absolutely not.
but I mean, I really, I mean, I think like these are creative relationships. You're both in the news industry. You're still needing to put the news in out, but like to be proactive is that like being able to like talk through why you made the decision you did is like the big thing in working with an editor is I did this here because I thought XYZ, right? Like, so, I mean, I think it's the same with anything, as long as like you understand why you did it and you can explain why you did it, then you're going to get into territory of either A, convincing the editor, or B, coming to like, compromise on something, or B, just being overruled. That always happens too. But I think again, you got to know what you're doing, essentially. That's the trick.
All right. So this is going to be our last question here. So our person, I'm not 100% sure what they meant. So if you need a follow up, we can ask. But can you say more about the Breaking Bad story structure that you mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like that series, I mean, it's a really entertaining series. I don't know if you've seen it. It's a really entertaining watch. But basically, like the slide I showed you was sort of like this. Hold on, let's see if I can pull it up really quickly. Is that we had to really like think through every single chapter. Like we couldn't start writing until we knew like what was in it, right? So like um so we have one, two, three, four. We have five chapters here, and we had to like plot all of them out before we even started. So like and the thing that really makes these things work is that like uh the first act of the like chapter is like something puts the story in motion and the characters start making choices. The second act is like characters are debating how they're going to get what they want. Often we're bringing in new characters. The third act is typically like old, new, and recurring characters are making preparations to get what they want, which will impact the other characters. And then act four is like the plan typically goes into action, and then expected or unexpected things like happen that set us up for the next chapter, right? So if we're looking at like the first chapter, if you were able to read it, like um,
Mhm.
we're using the first act to tell Jeff Mitchell's story. We're using the second act to introduce Pacificor, the history, the company, and Mitchell starting to pull allies together to like talk. The third act gets us to like lets us pick up on other story threads and tensions, namely the farmer rebellion that's sort of brewing up like north, and all of the like racism that's coming with it, like that adversarial sort of relationship. And then the fourth act is we're getting our main characters to go take action, and it ends with them like going to Scotland, right? And so we use this in every sort of single one of the chapters, is to make sure that like that it's not necessarily emotion based, like I was talking about with our other feature
Mhm.
writing. This is more based on characters and their decisions, and how those decisions impact their world and other people's world. And that's really what we were thinking about a lot with the story, was making sure that like more or less these were character driven plots, not necessarily plots that had emotional undertones to them. I don't know if that helps,
Excellent.
but I promise you, if you watch the first episode of Breaking Bad and then like just see where the breaks are, you can skip anywhere in the series and see that it's the exact same thing. Like the third act is always them like stealing chemicals or robbing a train. Like they're doing the thing,
Yeah.
like to like before like and the second act is always like we need to cook. Yeah, we need to cook. And then like the third act is like they cook, and then something like it's every single time. It's just crazy to me that the second act of every one of those shows is like we should do that, and they're like, yeah, we should do that, and it's 10 minutes of people being like, yeah, we should do that. And then like third act is like, okay, let's go get the stuff to do that. Okay. Like it's crazy how it works. And it's really like it was really an eye opener for me to be like, holy like Oh,
This is
geez,
like
man. Like this
prestige
guy's
television. This is some of
it's
like the best
prestige television.
writing
It is.
around.
And it really is. I mean, it tells you what you can innovate with when
Yeah.
you have like a really like the simplest structure
Mhm.
possible and how they were able to push that in crazy directions, right? But it's the same every single one of them. And it's like after watching a few, I was like, oh, huh, we should do that.
Yeah. And like what a cool way to look at the world. You're looking for kind of the building blocks
Yeah.
of all the stories. That's really fun. Excellent. All right. Thank you so, so much, everybody, for joining. Thank you so much, Tristan, for being here. We super appreciate it. Any feedback that you have can go to canadian.programs@jhr.ca. It's in the chat. And if you are interested in coming to more of these, we certainly hope to see you again. Please watch either the JHR or IJ social media channels for more entries in this wonderful series. Thank you so much, everyone.